This is chapter 16. In the late afternoon, Matt sat in the cabin doorway. He couldn't think of any work to do. He felt restless, the excitement still jumping about inside him. He needed to talk to someone. He wanted to tell his father about the bear. Thinking of his father, he felt the snake of worry crawling about behind every other thought. That worry was becoming more frequent every day. What could have kept his father so long? Suppose some accident had befallen him? The meeting with the bear had shaken Matt's trust in the forest. Now it seemed to close him in on every side, dark and threatening. Suppose his father had met with a bear. Suppose he had never got back to Quincy. How would his mother know where to find this place, or even where to send anyone to look for him? Matt hugged his arms around his chest, but the cold was inside. It would not go away. Something moved at the edge of the forest. Matt leaped to his feet. A stranger came walking into the clearing. With an ugly chill against his backbone, Matt stared at the hideous painted face. Then he recognized Etienne, a very different Etienne from the boy who had walked with him in the forest that morning. The Indian boy had washed his body, and it shone with the fresh grease. He had combed his tangled black locks down his cheek on either side, and on his forehead ran broad streaks of blue and white paint. On a cord around his neck dangled a row of new bear's claws. In case Etienne had noticed his first alarm, Matt greeted him boldly. "What's the war paint for?" he demanded. "Not war paint," Etienne answered. "Squaws make feast with bear. My grandfather says you come." Matt hesitated, unable to believe his ears. It took him a moment to realize that this was actually an invitation. "Thanks," he stammered. "I'm sure like some of that bear meat. Wait till I get my jacket." "Shut door," Etienne reminded him. "Maybe another bear come." Etienne was in good humor. He had made one of his unexpected jokes. "Long way," Etienne said after time. Matt was certain that they must have been walking fast for more than an hour. He remembered that Etienne had already walked all this way to fetch him, and he kept silent. It was so dark now that he could barely see to put one foot before the other. But he realized that they were on a well-beaten trail. Just as the last light was glistening above the treetops, they reached a riverbank. Drawn up at its edge was a small birch canoe. Etienne motioned him to step into it. Then he gave a push and leaped nimbly into the stern. His paddle moved soundlessly. Grateful to sit still, Matt was entranced by the speed, the silence, the gliding shadows on the silver river. He was regretful when in a very few strokes they reached the other side. Now Matt could see a glimmer of light deep in the woods. Etienne led him toward it, and presently their way was barred by a solid wall of upright posts, a stockade. For the first time, a quiver and uneasiness made Matt falter. But stronger than any doubt, curiosity drove him on. Not for one moment would he have turned back. Eagerly, he followed Etienne through a gateway and into an open space filled with smoke and moving shadows and wavering patches of light cast by birch bark torches. All around him in a circle rose the dim shapes of cabins and cone-shaped wigwams. In the center of the circle, a long, narrow fire was burning in between the walls of logs. Suspended on timbers hung 3 iron pots, sending up rosy curls of steam into the smoky air. The fragrance of boiling meat and pungent herbs made Matt's stomach crawl. Then he was aware of the Indians. They sat silently on either side of the fire, their painted faces ghastly in the flickering light. They were clad in an odd medley of garments, some in Englishmen's coats and jackets, others with bright blankets draping their shoulders. A few had feathers standing straight up from headbands. Everywhere there was a gleam of metal on arms and chests. Women in bright cloth skirts and odd pointed caps moved about without a sound, adding wood to the fire or stirring the contents of the kettles. Light glinted on their silver armbands and necklaces. Clearly, the Indians had put on their finest array for this feast. It came over Matt with a rush of shame how very shabby he must look in their eyes. Even if Etienne had warned him, what could he have done? He had no other clothes for him to wear. Probably Etienne had known that and so had said nothing. No one seemed to notice him, yet he was conscious of the unblinking stare of the row facing him. The others did not turn their heads. They seemed to be waiting. In the silence, Matt's heart beat so loudly they all surely must have heard it. After a long pause, one man rose slowly and came toward him. It was Sakins, his painted face streaked, barely recognizable. He wore a long red coat decorated by a handsome beaded collar and metal armbands. A crown of feathers rose from the beaded band and around his forehead. He stood very tall, and there was pride in his stern features. Why, Matt thought he looked like a king. Kiwa, Sakni said with dignity. White boy, welcome. In a sudden terrifying yell, the rows of Indians echoed this greeting. Tahoe, they shouted. Tahoe. Ye, yake, yay. Kiwa, Matt stammered in return, then more boldly. Kiwa. The Indians seemed satisfied. Smiles flashed in their dark faces. There was rough laughter, and then, seemingly to forget him, they began to jabber at each other. From nowhere, children suddenly crowded around him, giggling and daring each other to touch him. Matt's heart slowed its pounding. There was nothing to fear in this place, but after the weeks of stillness in the cabin, the noise was confusing. He was grateful when Etienne came to his rescue and led him to a seat at the end of a log. An old woman approached and held out to him a gourd cup. It contained a sweetish drink, acid and flavored with maple sugar, good on his dry tongue. Saknis raised his arm, and instantly the clamor was silenced. There was no doubt Etienne's grandfather was the leader here. An Indian brought him a long pipe, and Saknis put it to his lips and slowly blew out a long wreath of smoke. The rows of Indians waited respectfully for him to speak. Instead, the old man turned to his grandson and held out the pipe. Etienne stepped into the center of the clearing. In the firelight, he stood straighter and slender, his bare arms and legs gleaming. Matt had never seen him like this. Proudly, he took the pipe and set it briefly to his own lips and handed it back to his grandfather. Then he began to speak. Matt did not need to understand the words. He soon realized that Etienne was recounting of the morning's adventure. Watching his gestures, Matt felt himself living again the walk through the woods, the meeting with the small cub, and the fearsome mother about to charge. As Etienne spoke, the Indians urged the boy on with the grunts and shouts of approval and pleasure. Etienne tensed his body. He uttered a sharp cry, pointed at Matt, and made a flinging sweep of his arm, hurling an imaginary rabbit. The seated figures broke into loud cries, shouting, "He!" grinning and pointing at Matt, swinging their own arms in imitation. Matt's cheeks were hot. He knew that they were making fun of him. But as boisterous as it was, the sound was friendly. Now they turned back to Etienne and followed his story with growing excitement. Etienne certainly did make a good story of it. His telling took a lot longer than the actual event. Plainly, they all enjoyed it, and listening, they were all taking part in it. Etienne was a skillful storyteller. Matt could understand now just how he must have been delighted then with his acting out of Robinson Crusoe. When the narrative was over, the Indians sprang to their feet. They formed a long line. Then began a sound that sent a tingle, half dread, half pleasure, down Matt's spine. A lone Indian had leaped to the head of the line, beating a rattle against his palm in an odd, stirring rhythm. He strutted and pranced in ridiculous contortions, for all the world like a clown in the village fair. The lines of figures followed after him, aping him and stamping their feet in response. Etienne was at his side again. "Dance now," he said, "then feast." The rhythm of the rattle quickened. The line of figures now wove around the fire, faster and faster. Women joined now at the end of the line, linking their arms and swaying. Finally, the children, even the small children, were dancing, stamping their small, naked feet. "Dance," Etienne commanded. He seized Matt's arm and pulled him into the moving line. The men near him and cheered him on, laughing at Matt's stumbling attempts. Once he caught his breath, Matt found it simple to follow the step. His confidence swelled at the rhythm, throbbed through his body, loosening his tight muscles. He was suddenly filled with excitement and happiness. His own heels pounded against the hard ground. He was one of them. He came back to earth with a stitch in his side. His legs threatened to give way under him. The dancing seemed to have no end. Determined that Etienne should not see him weakening, he moved faster and stamped harder. Finally, when he felt he could not make the circle one more time, the dance ended. The feasting began. A squaw brought him a wooden bowl with the thick, hot stew and a curiously carved wooden spoon. The first steaming mouthful burned against his tongue, but he was too hungry to wait. He thought nothing had ever tasted so good, the dark, greasy, and spicy. This was bear meat. Presently he noticed that Etienne sat beside him, eating nothing. "You are not eating," he said with a sudden doubt. "Have you given me your share?" "This is my bear," the boy answered. "I kill, not eat. Maybe not get any more bear." He didn't sound as if he minded in the least. In fact, he was proud of not eating. When Matt's bowl was empty, the squaw refilled it. By the time he was finished, sleepiness began to drag out his eyelids. He could scarcely hold them open. Etienne seemed in no hurry to leave. The Indians were enjoying themselves, refilling their bowls and shouting at each other, laughing and slapping their legs at what seemed to be uproarious jokes. This was noisier than any celebration Matt had ever seen in Quincy, even on muster day. Why had he ever thought that the idea that Indians were a dull lot? At last, however, they fell silent, and Matt saw that one of them was beginning another story. It promised to be a long one. Between sentences, the speaker drew on his pipe, and the smoke curled from his nose and mouth as he spoke. Matt's head drooped and came up with a painful jerk. He had almost fallen asleep sitting up. Etienne laughed and motioned him to his feet. At the thought of tramping all the way back to the cabin, Matt groaned. It must be close to midnight. Then he saw that Etienne did not mean to go back. He led Matt toward one of the wigwams and pulled back the flap of deerskin that hung across the door. Instead, a small fire burned, and by its faint light, Matt saw a low platform covered with matting and fur. Etienne made a silent motion, and Matt, too sleepy to question, gratefully let his tired body sink down onto the soft skins. Etienne stirred up the fire and left him alone. Once long after, Matt rose to hear the rattle and the pounding of feet. The Indians were dancing again. He was thankful to stay right where he was.